Hey everybody, welcome back to Global Conflict TCG. Ryan here with you. Um, so did a kind of a introductory devlog here a little while ago. So this is gonna be like I guess the first real devlog, and I'm gonna actually really dive into detail what I've done so far, my project for creating Global Conflict TCG in Unity using Playmaker. So my last video was only like 7 minutes, so I didn't really go into much detail, but this video I'm going to go into all the details of how I got to the point where I am so far. So it's might be a little bit long, but I'm going to cover a lot of ground. So if you're here to see anything, related to Unity and Playmaker, go ahead and stick around because I'll tell you right now what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about just my basic setup within Unity right now. We're going to talk about Playmaker. We're going to talk about Playmaker arrays and how I'm using the arrays to handle like decks and shuffling decks and moving cards throughout the game board, things like that. And then we're going to talk about some of the managers that I'm going to have in place for this game. We'll talk a little bit about drag and drop, things like that. So we're going to kind of cover a lot of ground here. I'm going to show you how exactly I got to where I'm at right now, and hopefully this helps somebody out down the road that's trying to make their own card game or TCG game within Unity, because I'll be honest, there's quite a few videos out there about making card games in Unity, but a lot of them are kind of centered around making Hearthstone type of game, where my game is much more similar to Pokemon TCG. So it's a different approach to actually a drastically different approach to trying to create with inside of Unity. And so if you're trying to make that kind of game like a Pokemon TCG, you're going to want to see these videos because I'm actually tackling it. I'm not done yet, but I'm going to bring you along for the ride as I figure this thing out. So let's get started. Here I am in the project. I have my scene view and my game view just kind of up on the same thing. They're very small because, to be honest, like one thing I've learned with Playmaker is that a lot of the work really gets done in this FSM manager. It's really, I swear I spent a lot of my time working on the FSM flows, working on the state areas, the areas within the states, adding actions, things like that. And then I've even, I use this actions menu so much that I've actually just placed it here in my menus section that it's always open all the time. I'm still pretty new to Playmaker, so I've been using it here for about a month. And I'd say from about a month ago, I've started to really pick it up and learn a lot of things. And, speaking of, there's a lot of great videos out there for learning how to use Playmaker, especially from the Playmaker or Huton Games channel, that you can learn a ton from there. A lot of great guys doing work with Playmaker, so check them out. I'm going to show you what I'm doing so far. So let's start with the basics first before I get into Playmaker and all that kind of stuff. Take a look at my hierarchy here, so you can see everything that I have in my game so far. So I haven't even changed the scene yet. Still says sample scene. I got the main camera. I got a canvas. So this version of the game that I'm creating is going to be 2D using UI components like UI canvas and things like that, UI images. So it's a different approach. So if you were to do this in 3D, of course you wouldn't use the UI elements. You would actually, make a 3D version of the card and, instantiate them, things like that. I will be doing that eventually, but for right now I wanted to stick with just 2D. Just for sake of like making it a little bit easier to handle, with regards to graphics and things like that. Just to me, it seemed a little bit less complicated. So I'm just starting with 2D. Eventually I'll do 3D. So anyways, 2D, I got my canvas, event system, that just automatically populates. Just leave it there. Playmaker GUI, that's when you install Playmaker from Unity. That's an automatic upload, so I don't touch it. I just leave it there. I have a test player one manager. So this is one of my first versions of creating a player manager. I have it disabled because I'm not using it. I have a unit card template here, which is disabled. When I was making my prefabs for my cards, that was one of my first iterations of it, so it's disabled. I'll probably end up deleting these. I have a turn manager. This is actually a blank object right now. There's nothing in it. There's no no FSM or anything like that. But the goal or the plan is that when I get to the point where I have to start managing the turns between player 1 and player 2, that FSM is going to go here into the turn manager. And then I have a startup coin flip manager. So right now this houses an FSM for flipping a coin, It's not actually flipping a coin right now, but what I do have it doing is handling an array get random. So I have a global array set up just to pick a random player, player 1 or player 2. And so that's what it'll do. It'll just pick a random player to start. Eventually, we do have to build a coin flip animation and a whole flow for that, or Playmaker, FSM for handling the coin flip and all that kind of stuff. But that'll be for a later date when we do that. All right, so that's everything in my project right now. There's really not much. If I open the canvas, you can see I have the background, which is like this kind of looks like a wooden table. I have the done button, which is, and here we'll just go and increase that so you guys can see it. So there we go. We have a button that says done. And if I open that up, it just says text TMP. This done button has a Playmaker FSM on it, which actually does what it says. It just clicks a bool for bool true or false for done action. That's all it does. I have a player object for player 1 and a game object for player 2. If there's nothing in player 2 at the moment except for the player 2 hand, which you can see the gray box up here at top, that's the player 2 hand. Nothing is wired up to it yet. So for player 1, let's go ahead and open it up. And you can see here, this is where I'm starting to actually build the game. So I have the first object here, which is a player 1 card repository. This is an actual physical or not physical object, I guess, but it is an actual object on the game board. And if I click on it, you can see the circle. So it's actually right here off to the side. It's not even on camera, so you can't see it. It's actually completely off camera. And that's by design. So the reason why I have a card repository is because the few iterations I did before this one, what I thought was the correct way is I would basically have an array full of all of the prefab objects or prefab cards for my deck, right? And what I thought would be the way to do was to have that array and then to instantiate the cards when you need them out of the deck. So, you wouldn't actually have the cards on the field. They would just create the object whenever you pull those cards out of your deck into your hand area, which is in the hand area being, here at the bottom. That was my approach initially, but what I found is I ran into a lot of issues as far as instantiating the object, and then when you need to move them around the board or move it to another list, I started to run into some issues. So what I ended up settling on was just at the beginning of the game, before anything even starts, what I do is I instantiate all of my game objects immediately to the card repository, which is off the camera. So basically, we just create and spawn all 20 of those cards, which I currently have in the deck. And then once they're in that repository, those objects have been made. And so at that point, they're still connected to an array list, outside of the card repository. But basically what I'm doing is I'm using the array to keep track of the cards within my deck. And I use that array to shuffle and to use get next actions and things like that. And then whenever we pull a card from the deck array to get next, we use another action called find child, which is going to find the child of the card repository. And then once we find that child that matches up with the card that has been pulled from the deck array, we then reset the parent to the player's hand. So I hope that makes sense, but it took me a while, probably a week, of coming up with different iterations of how to move cards from an array to the playing field and to keep track of them properly. And so that's what I came up with, and so far it's worked really good. I haven't had any issues with not having cards being pulled from the array properly, or not instantiating or popping into your hand the way that they should. So far through all the testing that I've done this last day, the counts are accurate, and I'm going to show you what those counts are, and maybe make a little bit more sense. So that's what the card repository is. It's basically just an empty object on the side of the game board outside of the camera, which will hold all of the physical cards when we instantiate them. Startup manager, that's an object. So this houses an FSM, which has a startup manager. Right now I'm using the test startup manager. This other one here, this other FSM P1 startup manager was my second iteration of making the manager. Had a lot of issues with this because I was using multiple arrays. So in that old setup manager, the problem I ran into was I had a global array for the player one's deck, and then a global array for player one's hand, and then a global array for player one active position, thinking that was probably the best way to go. And let me tell you, I ran into a ton of issues. Moving cards from array to array seems really simple. When you're doing the Playmaker action, it is simple, but when you need to move cards from array to array, but also move those cards on the playing field itself, that's when you start to run into some issues, especially when you're looking to trigger those events. So I have this one disabled. I keep it around just so I can remember the template of the startup. But this test setup manager is really the current setup manager I'm using right now. We'll get to this in a minute, and it'll make a little more sense. But just keep going. I have an object for the player's base. So if you're looking at this as like Pokemon TCG, this would be their bench. So the player's bench, I call it the base. I have a player one active spot, number 1, and then an active spot number 2. So I haven't talked about this really yet on this channel, but I've been doing a lot of play testing with the physical cards outside of Unity. And I'm starting to play around with the idea of actually having 2 active units at one time instead of 1. And the play testing I've done, it's actually really fun. It's kind of just a different approach. And so I'm just going ahead and I'm going to run with that in Unity and try to create it. So we have 2 active spots. We have a spot here for the player's hand, which is at the bottom of the screen. When the cards are instantiated, you'll see that only half the cards show up on the bottom. And we have the deck array. So this is I probably have to delete this. I was experimenting with using Playmaker, Array Maker arrays. And there's nothing wrong with them. Array Maker is a really nice tool. I've used it a little bit in this project, but I found it just a lot easier just to use the standard arrays from Playmaker. In particular, I like using them as global variables. I found it to be a lot easier, actually. But yeah, I had this. It was to house these arrays here on the side. So I'm gonna actually go ahead and delete that because I don't really need it. Coin flip panel. This is when I do work to get the coin flip action going on startup. It's gonna pop up in a panel like this. It says, "Congratulations, you won the coin flip. Would you like to go first or second?" And then you can see we have a couple buttons where you could pick. So that's all that is. It's just a panel that I've created. It's not being used yet. We have a P1 deck object, which literally all this is just the card back here. It just kind of looks like your deck. It doesn't serve any function at all. But this one does. This player one deck counter TMP. So this is a Text Mesh Pro object. This one does have a Playmaker FSM on it. And you can see here it is. Count player one deck array. Really, really simple FSM. If I open it up, you can see start state 1. Literally all this thing does is it gets the array length of my P1 deck, which is a global variable. If I look at global variables, here's P1 deck. So that's the player one deck. And it stores that as the deck count player one. That's the length. Take that variable and go ahead and shove it into the set text mesh pro UGUI text. There you go. Drop this variable here, set it to every frame. And so you'll see when I start the game, that little text mesh pro object will count how many cards we have in our deck array. So it's like counting how many cards you have left in your deck. Pretty easy to set up. And then I have another object here for the discard pile. It's just a blank object that we're going to keep. It's a spot where we are going to, when we have our cards to discard, we'll set the parent as the discard pile. That's all that is. All right, so that's what we're going to start with for now. That's all I have. I'm keeping all of these under a player one object just so it's easy. It's clean when you look at it. But let's go ahead and start up. Let's talk about the arrays, and then we'll go over the startup manager. So here's the startup manager, and so I'm going to kind of shorten up this screen because really all the stuff you really need to see is down here. So like I said, I am using arrays to track the cards within each player's deck. Each player will have their own array for their decks. And if we go to my global variables, you'll take a look. These are all the global variables I have at the moment. Some of these I'll probably end up removing because they're from earlier iterations, but this player one deck and the player one complete card set is really the main two arrays that I'm using at the moment. This complete card set, what my thinking is when this game actually does work, it'll be a complete list of every single card within Global Conflict. So it'll have all the cards. So in this case, it'll be all 80 cards. And then what I use this for is it just holds all of the objects that I need to have instantiated when I start the game. When the game starts, basically what I do is I take all of these objects and I physically create them onto the field in that player one card repository. And at that same time, they get added to the player one deck array, which you can see is currently empty at the moment. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actions. So player one startup manager really handles that entire process. And so it just right on start, state number 1, array get next. So what array are we looking at? That's that global variable that I just talked about, player one complete card set. So that's been selected. I have a loop event, so it's going to look to loop through the entire array. So there is that loop event right here. So I have that loop to this next state over here, and then of course once it goes through the entire array, then that'll trigger the finished event, which will go to the next state. Let's go ahead and just kind of shorten that up a little bit. There we go. Or actually, we'll just take this out for now. There we go. All right, make it a little bit bigger. All right, so yeah, that is state 1. So it's just array get next. So one thing to note about the array get next action is that is always going to take basically the top object within that array, or in our case, it'd be like the top card of the deck. So array get next loops over to this action or this state here, where in this state, what we're going to do is we're going to create an object. So that game object is going to be a variable here, which is going to be the card from complete set. So if I go back real quick, there's one thing I missed. On this array get next, the result of that object that we pull from this array is going to be stored as the card from complete set. That's the variable I'm using. So here we go to create object. I'm using that same variable from that array get next action. I'm going to establish its new parent as the player one card repository, which, like I said, is off the screen. It's actually out of camera. The spawn point, same thing, is going to be the player one card repository, which is off camera. Position none, rotation none, store object. We're going to store this object as a variable called created card on startup. One of the things I had to learn is you could just name the variables whatever you want. Just name them whatever makes sense to you. It's generally a good idea to try to name them something that you'll remember what it is, at least for myself. And then so after we create the object, we want to set the name. What I found is this is pretty important because a lot of times when you instantiate the objects or you create the objects from an array list, like I showed you, it'll create those objects, and then on the end of the name it'll add clone. So to get rid of that clone on the name of the object, I just have set name specific object, which is the created card on startup. That's what we just created, and then we're going to rename it the card from complete set. So it's going to go back to that array, take that to that array variable, take the name of that object, and then name it on the created object. So setting a name, it just eliminates some confusion. And then at the same time, we're also going to do an array add. So those same cards that we're pulling from, excuse me, the same cards that we're pulling from the very first array, which is the complete set, we're going to go ahead and add those cards to the player one deck global variable array, which is this array right here. So it's just one array to the other is basically what it's doing. But in the process, we're instantiating the cards on the playing field at the same time. All right. And so that took me a while just to kind of get to that, just to figure out, something that would work, because there's a lot of confusion, and a lot of times you would think the actions are straightforward, but I found that that's actually not the case. So this method does work. So we end up creating the objects. Once that's done, we're going to go to load deck. So now that the player one deck has been loaded with the created objects that we got from our card repository, we're going to go ahead and shuffle that deck. We'll shuffle it up so it's not in order. Once it's done shuffling, really quick, we're going to start another array get next action. This time we're going to pull from player one deck, which is our actual deck within the game. Same thing, we're going to store the result card from player one deck. This time we're not going to use this loop function. We're actually going to use a separate loop function for the FSM. That is important because one thing to note, if you use the loop event system here in the array get next action, so I could do it, I could just put loop here. The problem is you can't set a number, or I guess you can. I could probably put start index 0 and then 6, but I found it easier just to add the loop action and just put how many loops. I want 7 loops for 7 cards. There's different ways to approach it. I found it easier just to use the loop, and so that's what I do. I have another loop action, loop it 7 times, and you can look here on the screen. Let's go ahead and zoom in. That's as far as I can zoom in. From the loop event here, it goes to find child from repository. So we'll click on that. It's going to find the child. So for one, we're going to look at the player one card repository game object, which is up here. We're going to look at that object. We're going to look for the child named card from named similarly or the same name as the card from player one deck. Essentially what that's saying is we pulled an object from the player one deck array, which that object hasn't technically been created on the field, or it has no connection to the object that's created on the field inside of the card repository object. So we have to find a way to tie that back. And so the way I'm doing that is with the find child action, where I take the name of that object from the player one deck array, and then I search the player one card repository game object, and I look through all of the children underneath that card repository object, and I find one that matches my variable, which is the card from player one deck array. So I hope that makes sense, but it actually does work. So it looks for that child, and then it's going to store the result as card from repository. Next, I'm going to set the parent. So I'm going to find the specific game object right here. We are going to, so what this is called is the card from repository. So we found the child object here. Now we're taking that variable, we're placing it here, and we're going to change its parent away from the repository, and we're going to make its new parent the player one hand. So essentially what that does is you're going to have this card that's just kind of floating off in space outside of the camera, but once we change its parents, it's going to pop up here in the player one's hand. So what's kind of cool about that is we're not having to instantiate the card at the moment that the card comes out of the deck. The card has actually already been created off camera, and we're just resetting its parent and moving it over into the playing field. So that's all that's doing, is just setting the parent, which moves the card over automatically. All right, and so once we're done with this state, we go to remove from deck array. And so what this is doing, it's going to go to player one deck. That card that we took out back two states ago, this card from player one deck from this action array get next, we're going to take that same variable and we're going to remove it from the player one deck. So essentially what you're doing is kind of a physical way of looking at it. Here's your array, and we use that array get next, we're pulling a card off, and each time we loop through, we're pulling another card off, and we're looping through 7 times, so each time we're pulling another card and another card and another card. Well, the problem is the array, you can pull those cards, but the array, if you don't have a remove action, the array won't actually remove the card. It'll stay inside of the array, but you'll just keep taking the same card off every single time. So by having that array remove action, we're actually removing the object from the array. And then when we loop back around, we're taking the next card off of the array, and then we loop back around, taking the next card off of the array. So you got to have the array remove action to do that. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of like a physical way of showing you how to do it. But that's essentially all of this is doing, is it's removing that card from the array. So that way, when we go back, and all this state here, this is just a 0.3 seconds that it's going to wait. It's so that way when I click play, you'll see the cards will pop up, and they won't all just like magically appear. That's all that is. But to complete the loop, we remove the card from the array, we wait 0.3 seconds, and then we go back to the loop and get that next card, tick off another number from this loop, and we start the loop over again, find the next child, set their parent, remove that card from the array, wait 0.3 seconds, and then do the same thing with the next object. So we'll do that 7 times, and that'll give us our 7 cards in our hand. All right, once that is done, I just have an action or a state here for click done button. So this is pretty much the end of the startup manager from what I have so far. I just have it stop at the done button. The reason why I did that is because I was testing some features on how to look in the hand to find a basic unit. I'm going to save that for another video where I set up the actual, like, we're going to check the card FSM. We're going to check a bool to see if it's a basic unit or not. But I'm going to do that on video and set it up live. So anyways, we'll leave the startup manager here, but basically that's how I'm handling the 7 card draw. And so let's go ahead and take a look. Let's go ahead and open up the screen a little bit more. And let's go to play maximized, and we'll click play, and you're going to see it's going to be really fast. And actually, let's do this so it's not so quick. Let's add a state real quick. Let's just call it, let's do this. Let's just call it wait a second. There we go. Wait a second. And we'll add wait. Here's the wait action, and we will wait. Let's actually wait. Let's wait 3 seconds. We'll wait 3 seconds, real time. And what we'll do, let's see, we'll plug this in, wait a second, and then, we got to add a transition for finished. We'll take the finished action here, we'll go wait a second, and then we'll finish, and then we'll go and load the deck. There we go. So we'll add 3 seconds, that way they don't just like magically pop up on the screen. So here we go. Press play, and we're gonna wait 3 seconds, and then it should start moving those cards into the player 1 hand. And there we go. They're starting to pop up. Now we got 7 cards. Boom. Looks good. I actually can move these around right now. So I do have a drag and drop script on all of these cards, so I actually can move them around. The active spots, and actually this spot too, they do have a drop zone script, so I could just drop these cards in. I can drop this card in. It actually moved those cards back to parent, so that's one of the things it'll do. But yeah, so we could do that. But that's essentially how it worked. Another thing to look at, you see my counter worked. So I have 13 cards in the inside of my deck array right now. And so let's go out. So now we see that it does work. Let's go back to play focused. Kind of shorten that up a little bit, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's go ahead and click play again, and you'll see the FSM as it moves through the flow. So we're waiting 3 seconds, load the deck, boom, boom, boom. It clicks through 7 times, creates all 7 cards. And if I take a look, here is that card repository off screen. So there, it's just sitting there. And if this might help a little bit, if we look at our objects here in the hierarchy, here's our player hand. We have all 7 objects that are in our hand right now, which are in the player hand. As a child, is the player 1 hand. That's good. That's exactly what I wanted. And then we have our card repository here. So these are all the cards that are still remaining in our deck. So, you know, these cards are floating out in space. They're off camera, but they have been instantiated, and they are, and this is how we would check it. If we go and look at our global 1 deck array, we can see we have 13 objects, and all of these objects are the same as the children of the player one card repository. So they match up perfectly. So what we know is that this is working correctly. And essentially our way of shuffling the deck, grabbing the next item from the array, the deck array, and then finding the child in the repository, that is our way of having an array, but also having the physical cards, or the cards, the game objects in the playing field that we're able to draw from, and then set their parent to the hand. So I hope that makes sense. I know it sounds really complicated. It took me quite a while to get to the point where I was able to, come up with that way. It's kind of weird. It seems kind of weird, but it really does work, and it works a hell of a lot better than having separate arrays for each zone, because that's what I did initially. And where the problem with that is when you have an array for each zone, every time you move a card in the field, so like say I take this unit, right, and I want to move it to the active spot like that. Well, if I want to have an array for my hand and an array for the active spot, I also have to initiate that action to move that card from the hand to the active spot in the arrays, because the game object is not actually linked to the game object within the array, if that makes any sense. So what I found to be easier was just to get rid of the arrays for all of these zones altogether, and to only use the array for the deck, and that's it. Otherwise, like for counting my hands, or counting, how many cards I have in my active, or how many cards I have on my base, or how many cards I have in my prize section, what I'm going to end up doing is just counting children of a player object. That's really all I'm going to do. A lot simpler. And then of course, once you move cards, like out of your hand into another area, that's going to automatically reflect in the children of player one hand, or any other player object. So much, much easier. And then of course, what makes all of that possible is the fact that, let's take a look at our actions. We have actions for children that make it possible. So like if we look at the game objects, so you got all sorts of stuff here that we could use in our Playmaker states. So like we have get child count. So if you want to, so like when I set up the section for the prize cards, I'm going to use get child count, because if I just set aside 6 cards for my prizes inside of a game object, I just need to know how many children that game object for prizes has. That's all. Very simple. Way better than tracking that in an array. It just makes it way more easier. We also have other functions like find child, which I just used here a second ago. Destroy, we could destroy, of course, which you don't have to do that in this game. You can get random child. That's another one that comes in handy when you're looking for a random object out of like a player's hand. So yeah, that's how I'm going to do that. So I guess we'll leave it at this point. Or actually, before I let you go, let's take a look at one more thing. Slide that over. We'll kind of move this back again. Put that back down there. Let's take a look at some of the cards. So how about look at card repository? So NHA. Okay, so you can't see it, but I have a light infantry unit in here, and actually I could drag it up. Let's do that. There you go. Now we see it. So my light infantry card, it has, I think it only has a few FSMs on it. So you can see here I have one set unit card variable, drag and drop. That's the FSM I'm looking at right now. When you drag the card around, it'll kind of move throughout these different states. So if I actually go to this other one, should be under, actually we'll look at this guy here, this UAF. So if I pick this guy up, you can see it's moving through the states, right? So it says it's dragging, and then it says, oh, you're over this object, and then it lets me drop in, and then it resets the parent. So got that. My player zones, like my active zones, these also have FSM. So this is the boxes that these cards drop into. Player one active drop card. So what it'll do is it'll look for the state, It's going to set the bool, saying that the active spot has not been filled. It's false. It has a trigger 2D event, so it has a box collider on that drop zone. Same thing with the base area 2 has a box collider. So when a card enters its box collider area, it'll tell, they have a symbol tell it, oh, you have an object hovering over. It's gonna check the FSM bool on that card to see if it's being dragged still. Which if we go back to the card, look at another card, in this being dragged, it's going to set that bool to being true, and then at end drag we'll set it to false, and it just tells that drop zone that it's being dragged. It just tells it if it's being dragged or not. And so essentially when this bool goes blank, if the card is hovering over a drop zone area, it'll then snap it to that drop zone area and then change its parent to the drop zone area. That probably requires its own video. Where I learned this from, I'm trying to remember the guy's channel. I think it's Steven Scott. I want to shout him out just because I get a lot from this guy's videos. Yeah, Steven Scott Day Games. He does a lot of stuff for Hutong Games and Playmaker, and he has a video on Hutong Games YouTube channel that goes over drag and drop. This is the exact same method for drag and drop and then setting up drop zones. So check out that video. But I essentially did the same thing. Very simple, just using these global events, UI begin drag, drag, and drag. Pretty simple. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's as far as I've gotten for right now. I would say the next step is to continue to work on the startup manager. So we got to the point where we can draw 7 cards accurately out of our deck. So the next thing we need to do is when we draw those 7 cards out of our deck, we need to check them to see if any of those cards are basic units. Because if they're not basic units, then that would be like a mulligan turn, and you'd have to send those cards back to the deck, shuffle, and then redraw a new 7. So we're going to set that up. Now that I got this video out the way, the next video I do is going to be me setting up that function within the startup manager. So we're going to go through the process. I'll show you how I do it. We'll test it, and then hopefully that helps somebody out. All right, so that's it. I'm going to call it a day for this video. I hope you enjoy it. If you're tagging along to take a look at Global Conflict, stick around. I got a bunch of other videos talking about the game, talking about the physical cards that I've actually made in person. If you're here for Unity stuff, love to have you. I'm going to have much more videos coming throughout this series as I move along in this project. All right, thanks, and have a good one.